Saint Francis of Assisi, Life and Legacy. Before exploring the life and legacy of Saint Francis, it is important to note that discovering the historical Francis is somewhat complicated. Because Francis was canonized only 2 years following his death, hagiographers were more interested in trying to establish the saintliness of the saint than they were in recording things with historical accuracy. This is what has become referred to as the Franciscan question. If we are to arrive then at the essence of who Francis is, it is important for us to be aware of the context of the hagiographer, examining sources critically, even if those sources contain eyewitness accounts, such as those in The Life of St. Francis by Thomas of Solano. Francis, the Life. Francis was born to the well-to-do merchant Pietro di Bernardone and his wife Pica in the small Italian city of Assisi, sometime in either 1181 or 1182. While famine and poverty crippled many in Assisi during Francis's childhood, he was afforded a comfortable upbringing owing to his father's success in the fabric business. From a young age, he was groomed to become a part of the family enterprise. By the time Francis was 13 or 14, he was ready to become his father's apprentice. He also became a member of a fraternity made up of the sons of rich merchants that, according to Solano, was filled with young people who indulged in all kinds of vice and wickedness. Francis, by this time a charismatic and skilled salesperson, became a leader among his peers. An eccentric and egocentric teenager, Solano recounts how Francis was so vain in seeking to stand out that sometimes he had the most expensive material sewn together with the cheapest cloth onto the same garment. This created an extravagant and attention-grabbing costume. Francis spent of his earnings freely, furnishing lavish parties and earning a reputation as a prodigal. While Francis enjoyed this glamorous and outlandish lifestyle, he was nevertheless often confronted with the harsh reality of poverty and disease. Although Francis was generally disgusted by this reality, there was nothing more revolting to him than those who suffered from leprosy. One biographer writes, "He avoided such outcasts whose physical deformities were generally considered the external expression of moral or spiritual deformities, holding his nose and running away from them." During this period of Francis's life, Assisi was on the verge of civil war. Perhaps seeking the glory that came in battle, Francis and many of his friends joined Assisi's war effort to attack Perugia in 1201. The resulting battle was disastrous. Assisi was soundly defeated, and many of Francis's friends were killed. Francis himself was taken prisoner to Perugia, where he languished in a dark, disease-infested prison for more than a year. After this time, Pietro paid a ransom to secure his release, and Francis returned to Assisi, but he was now a shadow of his former exuberant and flamboyant self. Solano describes Francis as being worn down by a long illness. He appears to have contracted malaria and suffered from the terrible mental trauma of war and prison. Francis consequently slipped into a deep depression. In the spring of 1205, Francis attempted to rally himself from this depression by once again enlisting for military service. This time, however, he never even made it to the battlefield, falling ill before he got there. As he battled fever and nausea, Francis heard a voice asking him where he was intending to go. Francis shared his plans to enter battle, after which he heard this question: "Who can do more good for you, the master or the servant?" "The master," was Francis's reply. "Then why are you abandoning the master for the servant?" "Sir, what do you want me to do?" asked Francis. "Go back to your own home, and you will be told what to do." The next morning, Francis abandoned his military adventure and began the trip home. Along the way, he sold his horse and all of his battle gear, opting to walk home in simple clothing. When he returned to Assisi, Francis attempted to rejoin his old life of parties and luxury, but by all accounts he was now moody and distant. He also lacked passion for the family business, much to his father's dismay, and he eventually stopped working altogether. War and prison, it seems, had changed Francis's life, and he struggled with self-loathing and guilt. He sought the spiritual advice from his bishop, Guido II of Assisi, and began practices of penance and self-mortification, giving generously of alms and food to any in need, much to the disgust of his businessman father. Francis also sought quiet and isolation in the forests around Assisi, and would often stop in at the church at San Damiano, seeking a quiet place to pray. Francis's struggle soon became so intense that he finally left home without the knowledge of his parents, to live at San Damiano in late 1205. Pietro eventually tracked him down and tried unsuccessfully to convince Francis to return home to the family business, even putting Francis under house arrest for a period. Finally, the conflict between Francis and Pietro came to such a head that Pietro sought legal recourse, and they soon found themselves in ecclesiastical court. At one point in the deliberations, this dramatic scene unfolded. Francis left the hearings, went to one of the bishop's rooms on the side, and stripped out of his clothes. He returned naked, putting what money he had left on top of the pile of clothes, and gave them to his father, saying, "Until now I have called Pietro di Bernardone my father, but because I have proposed to serve God, I return to him the money on account of which he was so upset, and also all the clothing which is his, wanting to say from now on, Our Father who art in heaven, and not, My father, Pietro di Bernardone." By leaving his father, the family business, and the family fortune behind, it was clear that God was at work in Francis's heart. The process of transformation was confirmed soon after, as Francis encountered a leper. As noted earlier, Francis in his youth was repulsed by the mere sight of a leper. Now, however, he felt called to love those the world hated. It started with him reaching out to a leper, giving the man a coin and kissing his hand, and receiving a kiss in return. But it was not enough to do this once. A companion of Francis writes, "Some days later, Francis took a large sum of money to the leper hospital, and gathering all the inmates together, he distributed it, kissing each of their hands." For Francis, this was a watershed moment in his journey of faith. He writes, "The Lord granted me to begin doing penance this way. When I was in my sins, just to see lepers was very bitter for me. And the Lord himself took me among them, and I showed mercy to them. And on leaving them, what seemed bitter to me had turned for me into sweetness of body and soul. And afterwards, I waited a little and left the world." So how did Francis leave the world? It began with him receiving a calling during one of the times of prayer before the cross at San Damiano, his new home where he was living. As he was reflecting on the passion and crucifixion of Christ, he heard a voice ask, "Francis, don't you see that my house is being destroyed? Go then and rebuild it for me." To which Francis replied, "I will do so gladly, Lord." Francis did this first in a literal sense, procuring supplies and doing the physical labor to repair and restore the crumbling structure at San Damiano, beginning sometime in 1206. Later in Francis's life, God's call to rebuild the church would take on a deeper significance, as we soon shall see. In 1208, something unexpected happened to Francis. As he put it, "The Lord gave me some brothers." Bernard of Quintaville and another man from Assisi named Peter came to San Damiano to join Francis in his life of penitence. Leading others was not something Francis was seeking or prepared for. Nonetheless, the three of them sought to live according to God's scripture. So they came to Francis's family parish, San Nicolo di Piazza. There they underwent a practice known as sortis biblicae, opening the Bible to random verses in the hopes of discovering God's will for them through scripture. As was the custom, they opened the altar Bible 3 times. The first passage came from Mark 10, where Jesus instructed a young man to go sell everything you have and give to the poor. The second passage came from Luke 9, where Jesus instructed the 12 to take nothing for the journey. And the final passage they opened to was from Matthew 16. Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. The unity in the theme of these 3 passages left the 3 brothers convinced of their calling. They would give all they had to the poor. They would rely on others, taking nothing for the journey. And they would deny themselves and live by the way of the cross. These things taken together would form the center of what Francis would later call his form of life, and they would be foundational in what would eventually become the Franciscan order. In 1209, Francis and these brothers were confirmed in their penitent life by Pope Innocent III, and they were also commissioned to preach. Francis and his brothers began the journey of learning how to live a life of public preaching and private penitence. It was a balance that Francis struggled with, but as many others began joining them, as a community they began to find a rhythm of service and contemplation. Francis may not have been aware of it, but he was now fulfilling God's command to rebuild the church in ways that had nothing to do with repairing buildings. Jacques de Vitry, a French historian and church leader, provided this assessment of the state of the church at Rome. After observing cardinals and bishops there, he wrote that he had encountered a great deal that was repugnant to me. They were so occupied with worldly affairs, with rulers and kingdoms, with lawsuits and litigation, that they hardly let anyone speak of spiritual things. However, after seeing the communities of Francis and one of Francis's most influential disciples, Clare, Jacques reported that these lesser brothers and sisters were a source of consolation. He noted the ways in which they patterned their communities after the early church in the book of Acts. They spent nights in prayer and contemplation and spent the days going into the cities and villages, serving and seeking to win people to Christ. They were poor, but they enjoyed the favor of many, and many desired to join the communities. Jacques believed the reason they enjoyed such success was that they were able to preach not only in word, but through their example. Francis's efforts did not only focus on the posture and practice of local communities. He also sought to carry out the Church's missionary mandate. In 1219, Francis engaged in a well-documented missionary adventure in Egypt. For almost 20 years, the supreme leader of the Muslims, Saladin, had held Jerusalem. In an attempt to regain the Holy Land, Pope Innocent launched the Fifth Crusade in 1217, laying siege to the Muslim stronghold of Damietta on the Nile River. Francis had long desired to travel abroad, but poor health and circumstances had prevented him from doing so until 1219, when he arrived at the siege. At great risk to his own life, Francis crossed into enemy territory during a cessation of hostilities and miraculously received an audience with the Sultan, Malik al-Kamil. Al-Kamil, unsure of his intention, wondered perhaps if Francis had come to convert to Islam, to which Francis replied graciously that he had not come of his own initiative, but at the calling of God to share the true gospel of Jesus Christ. Perhaps hoping that Francis was not just there to share the gospel, but possibly also offer a political end to the siege, the Sultan entertained Francis for several days. But after making no political headway, he ended the conversation and returned Francis across the lines. Although the Sultan did not convert, Francis's visit would have a profound impact on generations of Christians to follow, especially in the area of cross-cultural missions. After returning from his trip to Egypt, Francis returned to Assisi in poor health. He also returned to find that his community, under interim leadership, had lapsed into practices that were far too comfortable, especially with regards to their commitment to poverty and reliance on God. Given both his declining health and the difficult challenges he faced within his community, the year between 1220 and 1221 became known as his Annus Horribilis, the most painful year of his life. In response to these struggles of the community, Francis began to work on what became known his formal rule of life. This process, though, caused him further stress, and he felt like he could no longer properly care for his flock. This eventually led Francis to resign as the community's leader in the fall of 1220. While he was no longer the official leader, Francis still led by example. His first rule was completed in 1221, but he continued to work on revising it until a second rule was produced in 1223, when it was approved by Pope Honorius and became the official rule of the Franciscan order. From this time on, Francis began to withdraw himself from the community. His health, ravaged by the effects of malaria, continued to deteriorate, and he developed an eye condition that made it extremely painful for him to be in the light. Francis did not view his suffering as physical alone, rather seeing his pain as part of a larger spiritual battle. In his last days, Francis experienced a vision that both comforted him, yet distressed him. While praying at a retreat in Laverna in 1224, Francis had a vision of a crucified man with the 6 wings of a seraph. His close companion, Angelo, describes the effect this had on Francis. Quote, "When the vision passed, the soul of Francis was afire with love." But the incident also disturbed Francis, for shortly after the vision, Francis developed markings on his hands, feet, and sides. These marks, which later became known as the stigmata of St. Francis, imitated the nail markings of Christ and were for Francis as painful physically as his inner trials were spiritually. With his health in steady decline, Francis returned to Assisi from Laverna, where his closest companions cared for him, and where he began work on his last testament. He died on October 3rd, 1226. Francis was canonized as a saint by Pope Gregory IX in 1228, and he was hailed as the renovator of the Church, sent by God at the 11th hour. As we have seen, Francis's response to God's grace and calling in his life were remarkable. Through his obedience, his love for God and for others, he has left a legacy that has both inspired and challenged Christians through the ages. How, though, is his legacy relevant for us today in 21st century Canada? Although there could be many points to touch on, I will focus on 4. Francis's spiritual posture was one of obedience and humility. In obedience, Francis sought to live the holy life and calling God placed on him. Although many of his practices of penitence bordered on the extreme, for example, he would immerse himself in ice water in the winter to fight off sexual temptation, Francis genuinely sought to obey Christ in all that he did. He did not seek treasure or comfort on this earth, finding God's grace and provision in his poverty. He sought to serve his brothers, to become, in essence, a lesser brother, subject to all. And he served and loved the least of these, the poor and the lepers that society, and that he himself at one time had rejected. He did this with love, generosity, and little thought to the cost to himself. Francis's example remains a powerful countercultural witness for us today, as we live in a society that is consumer-driven, self-centered, and that oppresses those on the margins. Francis's community, especially before he journeyed to Egypt, was like the early church described in Acts chapters 2 through 4. They were united in purpose, enjoying the favor of everyone around. They shared all they possessed in common. They spent time in contemplation, but also moved out into the mission of God, sharing the gospel with those around and serving the poor and lepers. In a time where our church is struggling to be relevant in our culture, the Franciscan communities stand as an example of how a church community can be both a place of spiritual formation and of missional living. Francis is a shining example of carrying out the Great Commission, equipped with boldness and grace by the Holy Spirit. Today, many Christians are afraid to share the gospel, despite the fact that Christ has commissioned all of his followers to go and make disciples. Francis, seeking to remain faithful to this commission from God, went into a war zone and shared the gospel with the enemy at great risk to himself. His encounter with the Sultan also led him to write, in his first rule, effective ways of carrying out mission among Muslims and others. Francis remains an example for carrying out the Great Commission and for cross-cultural missions. From the time Francis sought silence and solitude in the forests around Assisi, he developed a special relationship with nature, displaying a profound empathy for the created world. He respected and loved nature for the way in which it praised God. Evidence of this is found in a couple of his writings. One of them is known as the Canticle of Creatures, and the other, the Canticle of Brother-Sun. Furthermore, many of the miracles surrounding Francis are reported to have happened in nature, including 2 incidents with birds. The first occurred when a flock of birds reportedly gathered around Francis and listened to him preach his now famous Sermon to the Birds. The second occurred near the end of his life, when birds came one by one to greet him in song as a sign of encouragement as his health failed. At a time when the earth is now being exploited for profit, Francis's relationship with creation is a poignant reminder of how precious nature is. His example also reminds us of our responsibility as caretakers and stewards of what God has made. In light of the life and legacy of St. Francis, some might say he is a saint for today. Francis began his life living as many today do, chasing wealth and fortune while many around them suffer. But soon God called him to a new life, one characterized by obedience, sacrifice, and humble service. He helped establish a community that worshiped God deeply, helped spiritually form its members, and reached others with Christ's love and message. In a culture today that prides itself on individual wealth, achievement, and self-centeredness, Francis's life is a powerful witness to the countercultural nature of God's kingdom.